enough that he was able to attend Brigham Young Academy and wear the starched collar of a college student. He also spent a year at Stanford under the auspices of the LDS Church doing what was called an educational mission. And at Stanford, he happened to take some classes from some of the leading geologic scientists of the day, including William Morris Davis, who was he's kind of known as the founder of the field of geomorphology. And I think it was while he was at Stanford that it must have dawned on Dave that, look, here are these people coming from all over the world to study the geology of the Colorado Plateau. This is my own backyard. And he started to put two and two together. In Glen Canyon, he had seen this stunning scenery and had gotten the idea that maybe people might actually pay money to witness this country. Well, he was always very proud of his education, and he made sure that his own children pursued college education. Here he is shown with his son, Jordan, who also attended Stanford. But he never graduated. He just didn't have the money to continue his studies long enough, and I think that really disappointed him. He wrote later on once that, "I have attended 2 colleges without receiving a degree, except perhaps an MD. I am a mule driver." But he really was rather more accomplished than your average mule skinner, I think. So moving up to 1906, when he hired on with the Grand Canyon Transportation Company, he supervised a crew of about a half a dozen folks, mostly from Kanab, friends of his. They started their trail from a point on the north rim about 3 miles east of Bright Angel Point. And you can actually follow this trail today. If you take the Ken Patrick Trail out to a little nameless point about 3 miles from Bright Angel, there's a sign that says the Old Bright Angel Trail, and that's actually the trail that Rust and Woolley put in, heading down into Upper Bright Angel Canyon. And it winds down through a very pretty part of Bright Angel Canyon. It's steep in places, but not terribly hard to follow. But reading Dave's journal of the summer they spent building this, I just realized what an amazing feat of construction this was. All they had was hand tools, pickaxes, rock drills, dynamite, and they were working through the heat of midsummer. For me, it's hard enough just hiking, and I can't imagine trying to hack out a trail. But there were springs and water, and that made it feasible. When they got to the mouth of, rather into the gorge of Bright Angel Creek, they pretty much followed the creek itself with as many as 80 crossings. And it wasn't until later, when the Park Service improved the trail, that they tried to bring it more up out of the canyon itself. When they reached the mouth of Bright Angel Creek, you can see the trail sneaking along there. Notice how there weren't any trees at the time. They later set about remedying that. But they faced the problem of how are they going to get people across the river? In reading their account of how difficult it was to construct this tram, I had to wonder why they didn't simply build a footbridge. It would have been easier in the long run. But they had some blueprints and engineering plans from a firm up in Salt Lake City for a cable that would run across from one side of the canyon to the other, and then they would suspend an open tram cage from this and use it to shuttle people back and forth across the river. Well, just getting the cable across was quite an undertaking. What they did is they took a small portable boat, it was kind of a little canvas-colored covered canoe, and they could pack this down on muleback to the river and set it up and use it to tow a small lightweight line across the river. And then they used that to pull the heavy half-inch main cables across the river. And these little boats you'll see again as Dave made use of them later on in his career. So they strung a 500-foot cable across the river, anchored well above. You can see Dave suspended from it up in the upper right part of the photo. They used kind of a painter's harness or a trapeze to shuttle their way across the canyon hand over hand. And in fact, for the first year of its operation, that was if you came down to the south side of the river, the winch, they had a hand-powered winch on the north side, and you had to get somebody in your party across there to winch everybody over. Later on, they installed a gasoline-powered winch to make this a little easier. This was a contraption called Little Giant. They ordered it from the Montgomery Ward catalog. The thing weighed 500 pounds. They somehow got it down to the canyon. And it developed 1 1/2 horsepower. This was enough to slowly haul the tram cage across. So here's Dave in his open-air tram cage. But getting it going proved to be more difficult than they anticipated. They had, as I said, these engineer specifications. And the engineer recommended that to test it, that they loaded up with a ton of rock first to kind of take the stretch out of the cable and make sure everything was running. So when they finally got the tram cage hung on the cable, here's what happened. This is from Dave's journal from April 1st, 1907. An ill omen, a sad day for us, a heartbreaker. We had salty coffee for breakfast, but that isn't the trouble. Just as we have finished the platform landing on this side and readjusted the little cable, we load the cage with about 2,000 pounds of stone and start her across. All goes lovely and jubilant until the car is nearly halfway over. Then, buzz, whang, kaplash. She sinks out of sight. The river eats it up like the monster she has proved herself. In the morning, my joy was at its height to think that we had succeeded in making things go. Now, as she all goes into the river, a pall comes over me, stunning, like some friend were stricken dead. I am incapable of action for several minutes. Then we row across to discover the weak place. The clamps have slipped off the other end of the big cable. We take blocks over and attach to the loose end, which is right at the edge of the water. We pull on the slack and go to camp. Sad, sad. Well, it took them another week of tremendous effort just to get the tram cage out of the river. And they had to refit the cable, hang it on the main cable again, and get it operating properly. But it did work well, and for a number of years, this was the only way really to cross the canyon, except by boat at this point. Well, this open-air cage was, I think, a rather, it was an airy contraption at best. One writer observed that when you got in it, it would roll out to the middle of the river on the sag in the cable and kind of sit there until the winch took up the slack. And as you know, there was often pretty good wind blowing in the canyon, and so the cage would set to swinging. And he described it as like being the clapper in a bell as you went back and forth. Well, they got some curious folks to come down to the river to see what this thing was. This photograph is the first paying passengers to go across on their tram, as Dave noted on his photo. A couple of young ladies from El Tovar that were working for the summer. But it was a pretty arduous undertaking to make it down the trail, and it wasn't quite the stream of tourists that they were hoping for. So in an effort to kind of improve matters, they built additional trail up the steep south face through the granite to the Tonto Bench, followed that along to Indian Gardens. This is looking back. You can see the canyon of Bright Angel Creek across the river. And they connected up with Ralph Cameron's trail that came down from the South Rim, ultimately completing what really was the first high standard trail across the Grand Canyon. William Bass, of course, had a trail further downstream, but the notes I've read indicate that it was a pretty rough affair in places and pretty much needed a guide to get across.